There are about 50 species of land mammals living wild in the British countryside. They're easy to overlook for they're secretive, usually silent except at the breeding season, and often active mainly at night. They're also easily disturbed, so that usually we get only a tantalizing glimpse of them, and that makes their identification difficult. But this video enables us to study the land mammals of Britain in their natural habitat and become familiar with their appearance and the way they move. And we can compare apparently similar animals. Some of our smallest mammals are shrews and mice, but if you know how, it's easy to distinguish one from the other. And what is the difference between a weasel and a stoat? They're closely related, but quite different when you know what to look for. This is an otter. But what other British mammals regularly go for a swim? Watching our wild animals is undoubtedly more difficult than watching wild birds, but it's very rewarding, and it can add a great deal to our enjoyment of the British countryside. The best places to see our largest native animals are undoubtedly in the Scottish Highlands. This is where red deer still live in the wild, often in quite large herds, the sexes usually segregated. In summer they congregate high up above the tree line, feeding on the new growth, but in winter they descend to lower grasslands and woods where there is both food and shelter. Those magnificent antlers are grown each year, having been discarded in the spring. There are other places in Britain where you can see red deer, for they've been kept in parks for centuries, and some have become re-established in the countryside. Their large size, up to 4 feet, 130 centimetres at the shoulder, helps to distinguish them from other deer. So does their red-brown coat, which has no spots. One point to watch when identifying any of our deer is the pale patch on the rump, which in the case of red deer extends right up to include the tail. The noisiest time of the year for red deer is at the end of September and early October, mating time, when the sexes are seen together. In deer, this period is called the rut. The stags round up as many hinds as possible and defend them against other challengers. Sometimes fierce battles ensue between challenging stags. Usually it's a trial of strength with no serious injuries, a weaker stag retiring when it accepts its inferiority. In some parts of the country, such as the New Forest, you can see both red deer as well as their smaller relatives introduced from the Far East. Sika deer. These are smaller than red deer and in summer have spots on their coats, although that may be hard to see in the autumn and winter. At the rutting time, the stags have a distinctive whistle. As well as in Dorset and Hampshire, there are feral herds in West Yorkshire, Scotland and Ireland. They're only about 2/3 the size of red deer. Another recognition point is the pale patch on their rumps. Unlike red deer, this doesn't extend upwards to include the tail and has a more distinctive heart shape. Another deer common in the New Forest area, but which you might see almost anywhere in England, Wales and Ireland, is the fallow deer. The herds in the New Forest are directly descended from the animals introduced into this country in the Middle Ages from Europe, probably by the Normans. They're common in parklands, and many have escaped into the open countryside. The males of fallow deer are called bucks. Smaller than red deer, but about the same size as sika, mature bucks have splendid antlers with a shape that distinguishes them clearly from other species. From the age of 3 or more years, there's a broad flat area on the antler which no other deer has. They too cast their antlers each year, usually between April and June. Generally, the older animals cast their antlers before the younger ones, and it's not uncommon to see an animal with its antlers half cast. The antlers soon start to grow again, and then they're covered with a protective skin with its own blood supply, feeding the developing bone with calcium and oxygen. By early summer, the females, the does, will be dropping their fawns deep in the forest or in high grass which provides good cover. For a while, the fawn's spotted coat acts as a camouflage, as long as it remains still. Sometimes a doe will have 2 fawns with her, one just born and a hanger-on from the previous year. By early summer, the antlers on the bucks have grown considerably. The skin which protects them at this stage is known as velvet, and it often attracts flies where it's been broken. The insects are at their greatest numbers in the heat of midday, and then the birds move in to collect them. Eventually, the velvet withers and dies, and by October the bucks are at the peak of their sexual activity for the rut. In wild forest herds, the master buck remains firmly in charge of his does and can usually cope with the challenges of competitors. In this open park situation, however, the deer are too crowded and the master buck can't drive away all other bucks. Nonetheless, challenges continue to be roared. In park herds, there is a lot of inbreeding, and colour variations are common, both light and dark. But all fallow deer have a characteristic rump marking. The white patch is bordered by a black, almost heart-shaped line. In contrast to fallow deer, roe deer are usually rather solitary in their habits, living in woodlands and fields where there's plenty of cover. They also have a pale rump patch, white in the female, less conspicuous in the male. When alarmed, this shows up like a powder puff, similar to sika markings, but the roe appears to have almost no tail. Roe also give a distinctive bark. Another way to recognize roe is by the black nose and white chin. Apart from red deer, roe are the only truly native British deer, and they're easily the smallest of the ones we've seen so far, less than 30 inches, 75 centimetres at the shoulder. Their mating behaviour is rather unusual. In the summer, the male may follow the female round and round a bush or group of small trees, producing well-trodden tracks called rings. The significance of this behaviour is not fully understood. Eventually, mating takes place. Roe are by no means the smallest deer you might come across, as there are some introduced species, notably Chinese water deer and muntjac, only 20 or so inches, 50 centimetres high. They occur in southeast England, having escaped from deer parks. There's one other animal that might conceivably be confused with a deer, though not for long, the red-necked wallaby. A native of Australia, it can be seen occasionally in the Peak District and in an area of Sussex south of Crawley New Town. These animals, of course, are escapees. They got out of private zoos around 1940, and their numbers have fluctuated with hard winters since that time. Winter is, in fact, a good time to see them, when there's less cover around. Scavenging along our roads at night, you can often see one of our most widespread and common mammals, the hedgehog. Unfortunately, a squashed hedgehog is also an all-too-common sight on the roads. The hedgehog, however, is safe from most animals except foxes and badgers on account of its ability to roll up into an impregnable ball. It also does this when it hibernates from October to March. In the spring, as soon as the weather becomes warmer, the hedgehog emerges over a 2-hour period, during which its temperature, heartbeat and breathing return to normal. During the winter, it will have lost a third of its body weight, and its first priority is to feed as fast as it can. And it's then that every gardener should welcome a hedgehog, for it prefers the very creatures that we regard as pests, a host of caterpillars, beetles, snails and slugs. A hedgehog in your garden is cheaper and more efficient than slug pellets, and a great deal more attractive. By late April, the hedgehogs will have reached normal body weight and be ready to breed. Although it's a familiar animal, its courtship and mating have seldom been observed. As with most hedgehog activity, it usually occurs at night, and it starts with the male in pursuit. The courtship is a lengthy and rather noisy affair. The male may go on circling the female on and off for several hours, trying to arouse her. There's an old joke which goes, how do hedgehogs mate? To which the answer is, of course, with extreme caution. But there's more to it than that. It's impossible for a male hedgehog to mate unless the female is receptive and willing to place herself correctly for him. She does this by lying with her hind legs spread out, her back arched inwards, and the hitherto protective spines laid flat. The male seizes her by the scruff of the neck, and mating takes place. A hedgehog's belly skin is very thin, and if the female did not flatten her prickles, the male could be badly hurt. Mating lasts only a minute, and the pair separate. The male plays no further part in bringing up the family. Indeed, the two animals may never meet again. A female needs to mate several times before conceiving, so it's usually May before she becomes pregnant. She then seeks out a quiet, secluded corner in which to give birth, like this man-made shelter under a pile of gardening odds and ends. She lines the nest with dry materials, dead grass and leaves. The babies are due about 5 weeks after mating. As the time approaches, the female becomes very restless. Giving birth involves much heaving and straining, but mercifully the mother doesn't have to give birth to an infant covered with sharp prickles. The back of this very new baby is dotted with little bumps, rather like goose pimples, from which spines will soon emerge. A second youngster is on its way. But already, only a couple of hours after birth, the first baby looks very different. Its sparse, blunt spines are sticking up from its back. For 3 or 4 weeks, the young are fed wholly on their mother's milk. But then the mother starts leading her family away from the nest on foraging excursions. By the time the leaves are starting to change colour, hedgehogs are beginning to build up their fat reserves to enable them to hibernate through the winter. Individuals from late litters may not have time to accumulate enough, and may not therefore survive the winter. If you enjoy having hedgehogs in your garden, this is where you can help. It's not difficult to find them at night with a torch or lantern, and if you discover one that looks small during the autumn, pick it up and weigh it. 450 grams is the crucial weight. That's about a pound. If your hedgehog weighs less than that, it's almost certain to die during the coming winter. So by feeding it, you will at least give it a chance. When it's ready to hibernate, it will do so anyway. The old country tradition about hedgehogs sucking milk from cows has never been substantiated, but there's no doubt that hedgehogs like milk. If you have hedgehogs in your garden, try putting out a bowl of bread and milk regularly for them. You may then have the pleasure of watching a hedgehog from the comfort of your house, and do the animals a good turn at the same time. Whilst the presence of hedgehogs in the garden may quite rightly be actively encouraged, it has to be admitted that the perpetrator of this requires some forbearance. There's not much mistaking the signs of moles. They can be found where the soil is suitable for burrowing almost anywhere in Britain except Ireland. They are therefore common in pasture, gardens, parks, and in woodlands, though the signs are less easy to spot there. The mole is extremely difficult to observe since it leads an almost totally underground existence. If you're fortunate enough to spot one active near the surface, stand very still, otherwise the vibrations of your feet will send it scuttling away underground. Moles are active both day and night, alternating between digging and resting. Each mole is the sole occupant of a whole tunnel system. In pasture, these may stretch for about 30 to 40 metres in the case of females, and rather longer for males. Moles live almost entirely on earthworms, but they will also take leather jackets and other small invertebrates. Although their eyes are functional, they're of little use underground, so they locate food with a long tapering snout, which has a highly sensitive tip. At less than half the size of a mole, the common shrew spends most of its time well hidden in the grass and leaves. It can be found almost everywhere in Britain, but not in Ireland. It's that long, flexible, pointed snout which clearly distinguishes the shrews from other small mammals. Clearly, it's partial to juicy worms, but shrews feed on a wide variety of small snails and insects, as well as woodlice and grass seeds. And like moles, they feed almost incessantly, day and night. They have a musky odour which makes them repellent to some predators. Nevertheless, your cat will kill them, although it won't eat them. And if your cat brings in a shrew that's less than 2 inches, 6 centimetres overall, it's probably a close relative of the common shrew, the pygmy shrew. If you see a shrew swimming, it's almost certain to be a water shrew. That's the largest of our shrews, measuring up to 3 3/4 inches, about 9.5 centimetres. It feeds on various aquatic insects and the remains of other large animals. And when numbers are high, as with all shrews, fights start easily. The water shrew's dark upper parts and light underside help to distinguish them from other shrews when they're found away from water, which happens quite frequently. Although common and widespread, shrews are too small and secretive to be easily observed. But rabbits are a different matter. You can often see them from the roadside or even from a train. But getting close for observation is more difficult, for they have a formidable array of senses with which to detect potential danger. Their ideal habitat is small pasture fields bounded by hedge banks, but they're widespread almost everywhere except high mountains and coniferous forests. They were probably introduced to Britain in Norman times, and by the 1940s had reached a staggering population of 60 to 100 million. In the 1950s, they were afflicted with myxomatosis, and their numbers were sharply reduced, but they're still one of our most familiar larger animals. They've colonised many of our islands too, and on some, such as Skomer off the Welsh coast, they share the cliffs with seabirds. The puffins often make use of the rabbits' burrows for their nests. In closed rabbit populations such as these, colour mutations often arise. These natural varieties have enabled breeders to produce numerous domestic strains, but these are truly wild rabbits. Rabbits live in colonies, and a typical breeding group consists of about 3 adult bucks and up to 5 does. They live in a world dominated by smell, and they're constantly interacting and checking each other's identity and sexual condition. Territories around the home warren have definite boundaries which are patrolled and scent-marked by members of the community. Rabbits produce 2 kinds of dropping. One kind, small, moist pellets, still rich in protein, is taken directly into the mouth to be chewed again and redigested. The other, more familiar kind is dry and compact and dropped at traditional sites known as latrines. The surrounding area is daubed with scent from glands beneath the chin. The latrines act as information centres, providing the colony with up-to-the-minute chemical news about the sex, age and social status of the colony members. If you see a rabbit doing this, it may be digging up edible roots, but the same action is very often employed as a threat display between rivals. Dominant bucks will patrol the borders and usually see off any bachelor males wishing to approach the resident does. But sometimes challengers collide in fierce battles. Fur can fly as the rabbits bite and kick. Long, needle-sharp claws can rip open flesh, and chisel-like teeth deliver slashing bites. They will sometimes fight to the death, and dominant bucks show little mercy to their enemies, banishing them to a life of exile on the edge of the community. Within the territory of a breeding group, dominant males have priority of access to females entering a period of fertility. During courtship, the buck pursues the doe, nuzzling her back and attempting to mate with her. The doe excavates a nest chamber or stop where she will give birth to her kittens. Stops within the warren offer best protection to the young, so does frequently squabble over these prime nesting sites. The doe gathers bundles of nesting material with surprising dexterity and ingenuity. Fur plucked from her body will complete the lining to the nest. A doe may have up to 5 litters, all in different nests, in the main breeding season from February to September. 1 month after a successful mating, a pregnant doe will give birth in the stop at night. The kittens will soon be left alone, huddled together for warmth and comfort. To minimize the amount of attention drawn to the stop, the doe visits her kittens only once every 24 hours for a few minutes suckling. Afterwards, she meticulously covers up and camouflages the entrance, scratching and trampling the earth to make it appear just another area of poor scraped ground. This helps eliminate any lingering odours, a necessary precaution against discovery by prowling predators. Later, the doe will move her young to the main warren, from whence they will set off on their first venture into the outside world. It's a measure of the rabbit's phenomenal fertility that these youngsters, within 5 months, may be caring for a litter of their own. Although this is a typical rabbit habitat, brown hares may also be seen on such grazing land. They are widespread in Britain too, although they tend to favour agricultural land, particularly the plains of the eastern counties and the limestone uplands of the south. With a little practice, you can easily distinguish them from rabbits by their longer body, longer legs and longer ears. Their ears also have black tips, unlike rabbits. A hare has a loping gait, and its tail, although white underneath, hasn't got the white powder puff appearance of a rabbit's. It's this sort of thing that has earned them the nickname of Mad March hares, although you could see these antics at any time during the long breeding season between January and August. Several males close to a female may become involved in a mating chase, but there's usually a dominant guarding male who attempts to chase other males away. It's the boxing which is most likely to catch our eye at a distance. Sometimes it's the males sparring for a female, but we know that females also frequently box with males to reject unwanted suitors. In the Scottish Highlands, as well as the Peak District in North Wales, you may be lucky enough to see mountain hares. They're less timid than brown hares. This one is in its winter coat, but in summer it becomes similar to the brown hare, although it's stockier and its ears are shorter. There are mountain hares in Ireland too, but they don't turn white in winter. Scotland is the best place to see our native red squirrel. You'll most likely find it in conifer woods or mixed woods where there's a large proportion of conifers. You'll recognise it by its chestnut red coat and tail, the underparts of which can be quite creamy in the summer. Outside Scotland, the red squirrel can now only be found in certain localities, parts of North Wales, East Anglia and Northern England. Other isolated communities occur in such places as the Isle of Wight and Brownsea Island in Poole Harbour. The red squirrel has long, distinctive ear tufts, which identify it beyond doubt. Without those, you could confuse it with the grey squirrel in winter, for then a grey tinge can develop in its fur. Squirrels tend to be more active in the morning and evening, but you can see them any time of the day. Their food is varied, but in pine woods, fir cones provide their staple food. Fir cones are also attacked by birds, such as crossbills, but they just split the scales open, leaving a ragged cone, whilst the squirrel eats its way steadily through it, leaving only a clean-cut core. This one has definitely been eaten by a squirrel. Grey squirrels are larger than reds and a good deal more widespread. They were introduced here from North America and today live in much of England and Wales, Central Ireland and the central lowlands of Scotland. Unlike the red squirrels, they frequent parklands and they especially like chestnut, oak, beech and hazel trees. Generally their upper parts are grey, but there is some yellowish brown along the back, and some chestnut coloration on flanks and limbs in summer, which could cause some confusion if you only get a fleeting glimpse of one. They build large leafy nests in the trees, sometimes in the branches and sometimes in tree hollows. There are 2 litters during the first 6 months of the year, and the young are born blind, deaf and naked, though by the time they're 14 days old, they will have a downy coat. The breeding dray is lined with a thick layer of soft material, such as grass, leaves and moss, but much of the nest is built from young shoots and green leaves, the collection of which inevitably injures tree growth. Grey squirrels are therefore not loved by foresters. Their worst offence is the habit of bark stripping. They discard the bark, but feed on the tree's sap underneath. It can happen during midsummer and also during a severe winter. It may be done to combat drought or to obtain extra vitamins. Grey squirrels come down to the ground to bury nuts and acorns, which they will find again by scent during the winter when food is short. And in open woodlands, you may see them travelling quite long distances over ground with that distinctive jumping run. We have many different kinds of small mammals in Britain, but each tends to favour a slightly different kind of habitat. One species in particular likes coppices formed by the ancient rotational method of cropping hazel trees. During the cold months of the year, it hibernates in a nest at or below ground level. It's the dormouse, not a true mouse, but a close relative. During hibernation, the dormouse's respiration and heart rate fall, its temperature drops, even the composition of its blood is altered. The return to normal takes up to 12 hours and imposes a great strain on the animal. It will have lost half its body weight, and now it must feed rapidly on green shoots, grass seeds and buds before it can begin breeding. Now we can see its recognizable features: orange-brown fur and bushy tail, which no mouse possesses. The tail helps it to balance when climbing. The breeding nest is usually about a metre off the ground, a rather untidy structure often made of honeysuckle bark or dry grass. Inside her nest, the dormouse gets ready to give birth. The mother herself is small, a little over 3 inches, 7.5 centimetres. But this scrap of life, blind and naked, weighs only 3 grams. It almost looks like a premature birth. As each baby is born, the mother picks it up and cleans it thoroughly. 4 is the average number in a litter. The eyes of the babies don't open until they're 18 days old. They'll remain in the nest for a month, much longer than any other small species. At 4 weeks, the young may begin to make excursions from the nest. They have greyer coats than their mother. As a rule, dormice are only active at night. Their large eyes and long whiskers help them to find their way through the branches, but young dormice not uncommonly emerge before it's dark. They're well suited to a climbing way of life. Apart from the tail for balance, both front and back feet are adapted for grasping, and they have small pads on them to keep a firm grip. As autumn approaches, dormice eat in real earnest, particularly nuts, which contain plenty of protein and fat and enable them to put on reserves for the winter. They turn the nut round, cutting through the shell with their lower teeth before removing the kernel bit by bit. A neatly opened nut with a smoothly chiselled edge is a real dormouse trademark. The edible dormouse is very different from the common dormouse, being about twice the size and having no orange in its coat. It could be confused with a grey squirrel, but it's much smaller. It's an introduced species found only in the area of the Chilterns, and there it frequently gets into house lofts, where it can cause some annoyance. Sometimes it hibernates in roofs too. They're called edible dormice because they were once a favourite food of the Romans, who reared them in oak and beech groves, fattening them up on currants and chestnuts. Unlike the edible dormouse, many of our small mammals are very widely distributed, occurring up and down the country in our fields and hedges. Among the most abundant are the voles. Bank voles usually prefer thick cover and generally don't move far into the fields. All voles have blunt snouts compared to other small mammals, and the bank vole has fairly prominent ears and a reddish-brown back. Field voles are very similar, although their coloration is greyish-brown. They're found everywhere, except in Ireland and on some islands. They feed mainly on green leaves and stems of grasses and growing corn, and they're active throughout the 24 hours, but mostly at night. You have to be an expert to distinguish field voles from bank voles, but apart from the slight difference in coloration, field voles have less conspicuous ears and a shorter tail. Our two small species of vole are preyed on by many kinds of birds, as well as larger mammals. But we also have a much larger vole, and this is its typical habitat: lowland rivers such as chalk streams, as well as ponds and canals in England, Wales and Scotland. This is the home of the water vole, the Mr. Ratty of the Wind in the Willows. But although this animal is sometimes mistakenly called a water rat, it most certainly is not. It's about 9 inches, 23 centimetres from nose to tail, and its typical blunt snout indicates clearly that it's a vole. Voles can remain submerged for up to 30 seconds, and they are lithe and graceful swimmers, although their feet are not webbed. Every vole constructs its own elaborate system of burrows. You have to be still and patient to observe water voles because they're very timid, but you can easily see evidence of their presence. The banks are riddled with holes. Each system contains a nest chamber and emergency exits, and at least one of the 3 entrances will be underwater. And here is another sign of water voles, a boundary marker dividing the range of one territorial male from another. The droppings on the log advertise that this male is in residence, and male callers are unwelcome. The water vole feeds close to home and uses its paws, rather like a squirrel, to eat any vegetation it can safely reach. Indeed, everything within easy nibbling distance of the feeding hole is soon consumed, and the resulting patch of closely cropped grass is known as a water vole lawn. Other signs of water vole activity are the runs which tunnel through the bankside undergrowth. Voles are extremely short-sighted, and the well-trodden waterside paths help to keep them on the right tracks. The runs are marked with a personal scent gland which announces individual territory within a community to any intruder. Even underwater, they tend to follow the same familiar channels between the weeds, and as they enter an underwater burrow, they deliberately stir up a muddy smoke screen to confuse any lurking predators. Occasionally, the brown rat is found in the same habitat as the water vole, but a rat, given the choice, although it can swim, prefers not to go into the water. The water vole, on the other hand, is totally at home in the water. Its short snout, giving it an appealing look, immediately distinguishes it from its greatest enemy, which so often takes over its burrows. Brown rats, common rats. They're found in most parts of the British Isles and are more abundant out in the countryside than many people imagine. Burrows are generally in sloping ground, banks or sides of ditches. Compared to the water vole, the brown rat has a pointed muzzle and prominent ears. These rats are thought to have first appeared in Britain at the beginning of the 18th century, possibly in shipping from Russia. Ever since, they have lived close to man. Anywhere there's food stores, scraps, rubbish tips, and of course sewers. Brown rats have now largely replaced the black rat, which once used to be widespread in Britain and which carried the Black Death. In fact, its colour varies, but compared with the brown, the black rat's ears are longer and almost hairless, and its eyes are bigger too. Mice are close relatives of rats and are among the commonest British mammals in country places. And the most widespread species is found in the fields, hedgerows, woods or gardens. It's the wood mouse or long-tailed field mouse. The tail, in fact, is about as long as the animal is from snout to base of tail, around 3¼ inches, 8¼ centimetres. Several mice may live together in underground burrows or under tree roots, and stores of food appear to be communal. Nuts, buds, fruit, bulbs, almost anything. Apart from its long tail, you'll recognize it by its large, prominent eyes and long oval ears, ideal for its nocturnal habits. Gardeners are often thrown into despair by their activities. At night they'll make short work of your newly sown peas, unless you first soak them in paraffin. Our smallest mammal is also a mouse. It's absent from Ireland and most abundant in the south of England, living in dense grasses, reed beds, and in summer in cereal crops. It's the harvest mouse, just 6 grams in weight and 5 centimetres or so, a couple of inches, from snout to base of tail. It's an active little creature and light enough to be perfectly at home on a single corn head, where it feeds in the summer. It's distinguished from other mice by its blunt muzzle and small hairy ears, not unlike the voles. This use of its tail is also typical. It's thought that both the number and distribution of harvest mice have substantially decreased during this century, and this may be due to mechanization of farming methods, including seed drills which produce widely and evenly spaced corn stalks. It's the only British mouse to build its nest well above ground level in the stalks. This is made of grass and provides a home for a litter of 5 to 9 young. Another species of mouse is also found in open fields, but prefers the immediate neighbourhood of buildings, the house mouse. These were probably the first mammals to be introduced into Britain by human beings, and they've stayed close to man ever since. They have a distinctive greyish-brown colour, and the eyes and ears are smaller than those of a wood mouse. House mice can breed the year through. In houses they average about 5 litters a year, with 5 to a litter. The young are weaned at 18 days and are themselves able to breed at only 6 weeks of age. The fact that we're not overrun by mice is due, at least partly, to the large number of domestic cats, which make most of their killings by intercepting mice travelling between buildings or moving into cover from the fields. But the only truly wild cats we have are now found only in the Scottish Highlands, and they are rarely seen. They're larger than domestic cats, but can easily be confused with those that have gone wild and reverted to a tabby form. True wild cats have a distinctive thick bushy tail with a blunt black tip. We all know that our domestic cats lead independent lives, and their numbers are so huge that they have to be regarded as a major predator of Britain's small mammal population, whether they live in the country or town. And in their wanderings they undoubtedly come into contact with other wild mammals. In such circumstances they're clearly well able to look after themselves. There's little evidence that foxes attack cats, and out in the country their largest prey would normally be the rabbit. They set about catching these in an apparently casual way. Foxes are found almost everywhere on the British mainland and in Ireland, and in recent times have become more abundant in urban areas. A study of the foxes in Bristol has shown that there's a population of about 500 foxes there. Although they're frequently seen in the early hours of daylight in cities, the foxes are mainly nocturnal, scavenging from dustbins, tips, litter boxes and garden bird tables. Foxes are at their noisiest in midwinter. The barks and weird, almost unearthly screeches are connected with mating, for it's at this time of year that foxes embark on their courtship. At this mating time, you're quite likely to see foxes in daylight. They become almost oblivious to their surroundings, the vixen leading the dog fox around for up to 3 days. It's an elaborate courtship, but biologically necessary, for the vixen is fertile for only a very short period, and the dog fox has no more than a few hours, once a year, to mate successfully. 7.5 weeks later, the cubs are born, in cities, in a disused cellar, or under a garden shed. And 6 or 8 weeks after that, some town dwellers can enjoy this rare sight: a wild fox family at play within a few yards of a house. Out in the country, where most of our fox population still lives, foxes may bring up their family in an old badger tunnel, sometimes occupying part of a set at the same time as the badgers. A fox's earth may be in a more open situation in remote country areas, but you would need plenty of patience to witness scenes such as these, getting into position downwind and waiting still and silent long before the vixen returns to call out her cubs. You need both patience and luck to see this animal, a stoat, one of a group of closely related animals of which the largest members are the otter and badger. The stoat feeds on rabbits and other smaller mammals and birds, and you could easily confuse it with its close relative the weasel, which has a similar shape. The stoat, however, is larger and has a long tail with a distinctive black tip. Its long, thin shape enables it to explore underground burrows and crevices in stone walls in its hunt for prey. This is a weasel in a typical posture. It's smaller than the stoat. Head and body measure about 8 inches, 20 centimetres, compared with the stoat's length of about 12 inches, 30 centimetres, without its tail. The weasel is altogether a more sinuous animal, although its markings are similar to those of a stoat. But it has a much shorter tail and no black tip to it. Polecats were once widespread in mainland Britain, but are now confined to Wales and adjacent counties. They can be distinguished by their creamy fur over much of the body, with some long, dark guard hairs. But there are also escaped ferrets around that have bred with them to form hybrids, and many of the sightings are undoubtedly of such animals. Another relative, which was once widespread, is now confined to the Scottish Highlands, Wales, Ireland and the Lake District, the pine marten. It has a distinctive pale throat and projecting ears. It's also larger and darker than a polecat, with which it could be only confused on the ground. Only rarely are they seen in good light. One member of the weasel family is amphibious, equally at home on land or in water. It is, of course, the otter, one of our most attractive mammals, but now, sadly, one of our scarcest. Fortunately, there are still some remote places where you have a good chance of seeing them, and the best of these is undoubtedly in the Shetlands. By waiting very patiently by the shore, you could have more than a glimpse of an otter fishing. This is a dog otter, characterized by its broader snout. This is the female, narrower in the snout. She's just about to lead her cubs from their hole down to the water for the first time. They are about 10 weeks old. After mating has taken place, the male has little to do with bringing up the family. 2 seems to be an average litter for otters. The young tend to stay with their mother for at least a year, and they remain a close family unit, rarely going more than a few yards away from one another, even when they're well grown. When a small or even half-grown otter cub gets separated from its mother, it gets worried and then becomes very vocal. Otter cubs can swim instinctively, but they're not very good at first, and they certainly can't dive. Their coats appear to be too fluffy and buoyant, and they're rather fat little things at this stage. Their mother appears to be giving them swimming lessons, ducking them under the water to teach them to dive. And it's in the water that the otter shows its true grace. Here in Shetland they get a good living from the sea, taking bottom-living fish, such as butterfish, sea scorpion, lumpsucker and rocklings. River otters also feed on fish, including a high proportion of eels, but they take a good variety of other food as well, aquatic insects, even birds and small mammals. Apart from Shetland or the west coast of Scotland, you would be extremely lucky to catch sight of an otter. In the rivers of the south, where otters used to be more common, you might instead catch sight of this animal, a mink. Animals started escaping from mink farms as early as 1929, but it's only in the last 30 years that they've bred in the wild and spread all over the country. About the same form as a stoat, they're larger and more uniformly dark, and they're not so beautifully adapted to swimming as the otter. And there's just one other animal that may cause confusion in the water. In East Anglia, there's a population of introduced koipu, rodents from South America. They're much stockier animals than otters and lack their sinuous movement. Koipus are not members of the weasel family, but the badger is, and by far the largest and most rewarding of them to watch in most parts of the country. Badgers are nocturnal animals, but from May to August, in quiet spots, they emerge from their setts before dusk. Their favourite habitat is mixed woodlands and copses, but you can find their setts in hedgerows, cliffs, moorland and open fields, even in towns. They usually have well-defined paths leading from the set, and you can sometimes follow them quite long distances. You may find they lead into nearby fields, for it's there that they search for their most important single item of diet, earthworms. Badgers, however, have a very varied diet, all kinds of small mammals, fruits, beetles, and you can often find where they've been digging out a nest of insects. They seem to be particularly fond of the grubs of bees and wasps. The labyrinth of large tunnels that constitutes a well-established badger set is unmistakable. The badgers spend much time maintaining it. The bedding which they take underground needs constant renewing, and repairs and modifications to the tunnels have to be made from time to time. All this activity around the set makes badgers ideal subjects for watching animal behaviour. A great mountain of bedding at a set indicates the likelihood that there's a family of cubs down below. This could be a good set to watch, but if you decide to do this, never walk over the set and always wait downwind, arriving well before the badgers are likely to emerge. And if it's private land, obtain the owner's permission. Hot air from beneath meeting the cold air above shows that there's life underground. Badgers usually live in family groups, and as they emerge one by one, there is usually a certain amount of scratching and grooming, sometimes of each other. And then, if they're cubs, there will be play. It's difficult to imagine a nicer way of enjoying our countryside than to sit near a badger set on an early summer evening to witness such sights and sounds. You don't have to go to the plains of East Africa to enjoy watching mammals.